Good afternoon and welcome, gentlemen. This is our second AALI Speaks conversation. Today we're going to be talking about African American leadership, and we're going to be talking about the home that once belonged to Sarah Daisy Barker Thomas. Today in studio, I'm honored to have with me Mr. Ed Corley and Mr. Scott Schott. Gentlemen, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, thank you, Alan. I'm Edward Corley, and I'm originally from Mansfield, and I've been here a good part of my life, and currently I practice law.
Thank you, Mr. Corley. Mr. Schott.
I'm Scott Schott, and I'm the curator of the Mansfield Memorial Museum in the Soldiers and Sailors Building.
Again, I'm Alan Mitchell. I'm currently the Housing and Community Development Manager for NECIC. So let's jump right into it. So, do you feel like enough people care about or understand the historical significance of the Barker Thomas house?
No, I don't. Daisy's father, who had the house built, the misconception is that there were several Civil War veterans that were ex-slaves that owned homes, but they did not build them. The importance of this house is that he bought the land from the mayor that was during the Civil War, and after the Civil War there was this empty land on First and Wood, and George was a well-respected chef in the major hotels that we had here, and was given a lot of advice from a lot of people. And he eventually, I'm assuming, saved the money, or he was helped. And so you see in some of the maps, all of a sudden the house appears. And it wasn't related to anything else except for George. And when you look at the old records and stuff, there's nothing. And then it is George Barker who is the owner of the house.
So I've seen a couple of different dates, 1874, 1875.
It's those two periods, because there are several pieces of paperwork. One says 1874, one says 1875.
So I'm told that this was no shack. This was a significant home. Can you tell me a little bit about the significance of the home?
This house, for the time period, is well constructed. It is the exterior of the house is 3 bricks thick, which was a period of time when they were doing that, but it wasn't common. And then you had the interior, like the fireplaces. He just didn't have a brick fireplace. He actually had a steel facade fireplace that was faux painted with decorations on and things. And there was a living room, there was a kitchen, a living room, and a dining room. And then upstairs there were several bedrooms. And eventually he added on to the house because they were part of the black community. And so there were a lot of people that stayed there on and off. And so he had to enlarge the house to incorporate that.
So Mr. Barker, the Civil War veteran, acquires the house. So who was Sarah Daisy Barker Thomas?
Actually, George was not, I don't think, a Civil War veteran.
Oh, okay.
He was trained as a cook. According to Daisy's notes, his mother taught him how to cook. I'm still trying to figure out if I can find a unit that he was in. Daisy is his oldest child. They had 2 children. One was Sarah, and the other one was Sumner. And unfortunately, Sumner drowned at North Lake Park. And so Daisy then was the only child. And she was very musical, and eventually ended up at Oberlin, and went there for several years. And throughout her whole life, music was her life. And she married eventually Captain Thomas. who was a black officer in the 9th Infantry of Ohio during the Spanish-American War. And she wasn't stupid by any means. She was very shrewd. She had a lot of investments. And when she married Mr. Thomas, who was her senior, she had him sign a 6-page prenup
Wow.
in the 20s.
So tell me a little bit about Captain Thomas and his significance to the community.
Unfortunately, no one has done anything with him, his life. Also, his commander, more has been done because he was the 3rd black man to graduate from West Point. But when it comes to the other officers in the Ohio colored infantries that were in the Spanish-American War, no one's really done anything on that. And he had a newspaper in Columbus. He was very instrumental in the early precursors of what the NAACP is today. And he knew George, Daisy's father, and his mother. And so during the election at the turn of the century, he was very instrumental in actually getting the black vote to vote for the Ohio governor. And to show how important he was, he actually was in the parade next to the governor, or just off to the side of the governor when they walked down in Columbus.
That's impressive. So Sarah Daisy Barker Thomas was part of the group that founded the Mansfield branch of the NAACP. How do you think that the demolition of this house affects the legacy of the NAACP or African American people in Mansfield?
Just for a point of reference, Alan, the house is located on the corner of Wood and First Street here in Mansfield, right? And it's one of those houses that people are aware of. I've had a number of people say that, oh, I know that house, that brick house. So the house is known by the community. The unfortunate destruction of the house has a lot of ramifications. First and obvious, we have, as Scott mentioned, the first house built in Mansfield by a person of color, and it was over 150 years ago now. So we would be losing that. That's something that you can't necessarily buy. And in addition to that, equally important, if not more important, that house is a symbol of Daisy Thomas's family and what they have accomplished. You know, many cities have monuments, you know, to their past, and this is a monument for Mansfield and Richland County, and also it's a monument to a success story, a American dream come true. You have someone who was born a slave, and within 20 years of the end of the Civil War, he's built this house. And it's not a shack. You know, it's literally a brick house.
Nice.
Yeah, and it's still standing. Well, it's still standing, not standing like it should now. But it just goes to show in America, and for a black family, what they were able to accomplish.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. What were racial conditions like in Mansfield in 1874 and 1875 when the house was purchased and built?
For the most part, the African American community was in the service community, where they would be maids, cleaners, working in the hotels as porters. One man who pre-Civil War really did stepped up above all of that, and that was Hiram Wheeler. And Hiram Wheeler was a gunsmith, and there are not many examples, unfortunately, of his work. His competitor and friend was John Ricketts. And John was very prolific. As the Civil War was, as the time period getting closer and closer to the Civil War, Hiram Wheeler then moved to Canada with all of his family. And I'm still trying to do research on to figure out exactly where and what, because now there's more interest in Canada in actually doing all this research on the slaves that fled from the United States to Canada.
So, post-Civil War, about how many African Americans were in the Mansfield, Richland County area?
I didn't look it up.
No worries, we'll move on from that one. So what's the current condition of the structure? And given the current condition of the structure, were you surprised that the land bank and the city agreed to grant interested parties additional time to evaluate the cost of saving the structure?
The house, 6 years ago, when the house was originally given to the memorial building, and Edward's on the board at the memorial building. And to their credit, they took a month to mull it over. Our finances are not high, and they said they couldn't take it. I felt it was very important because I had contacted the original owner of the house, because I've always saw it bricked up or, boarded up. It was since I've been here. And they decided they would give it to us. And then we couldn't take it, so then I went to the land bank. And then the land bank I gave a lecture to. And they decided, to their credit, they would take it. What transpired after that is not a good thing. And the house was in fair condition 6 years ago. There was some bowing on the first floor and some on the second floor. And that was because there was water in the basement. I had somebody who was going to actually loan us a pump. We were going to pump it out. The next door neighbor was going to let us use his electricity to keep a sub pump going so that there would be no water anymore in the basement. And over the period of the 5 years or so, what happened was that the center support beam that's in the center of the house literally disintegrated. And the last time I was in it was several weeks ago, and the front the first floor collapsed partially, and there's a huge hole. And when you look in the hole, you can see the notch where their support beam was, and all the brick are falling into the basement. And on the second floor, in the bedroom that's directly above the dining room where the other fireplace was, is now down about 2 feet. I'm surprised it's still up, but it's because of the construction of the exterior of the house that it's still standing there. I'm grateful and I'm hopeful that this person or group of people do come through, that they can get the money to save this house, because like Edward said, it's putting up a plaque of what was there is nice, but if you physically can have the actual thing there that people can go by and look at is really nice.
And Scott, if I'm not mistaken, isn't it a result of the water in the basement that caused the beams to disintegrate?
Yeah, the water saturated the first floor, and just the wood just rotted away. And now the wall, that center wall that was in between the kitchen and the dining room, has completely collapsed. And so the bedroom that's above, where the other fireplace is starting to bow even more down. So I'm hoping that something could be done quicker and sooner than later, because my fear is that as this goes on, within a period of a month, from the time that we were in there the last time to on the 24th of August, that entire support wall is gone. So another month, the whole building could be down.
Sounds like this particular podcast couldn't be more timely. What would you, well, do you feel like there's enough public support to save the structure?
I think there's an apathy towards most history. And it has nothing to do with race or anything else. I think in general, people are so used to doing all the new tech stuff that's around and they're what's going on in their lives now. I don't think they pay attention to the things that were in the past that actually have influenced what we are today.
Yeah, I would say that if people were aware of what is happening and what we could possibly lose by the destruction of this house, that there would definitely be an interest in saving this house, because like I mentioned earlier, a lot of people are familiar with it. You know, they know that orange brick house on the corner, and if they had any inkling that it may become a parking lot, you know, I think it would galvanize people to support it.
We hope it does. So, many of us are probably familiar with the term redlining, but some of us may not be. The term redlining originates with actual red lines on maps that identify predominantly black neighborhoods as hazardous. Starting in the 1930s, the government-sponsored Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Home Loan Bank used these maps to deny lending and investment services to black Americans. What did local African American aspiring homeowners have to endure in the 100 years preceding this systematic and institutionalized racism? And what's homeownership look like now in Mansfield and the African American community?
If you go back in like the directories that show all the people who lived here, the segregation was never, as far as I know, I did not grow up here. I grew up in Milwaukee. Milwaukee was very segregated. And when I was in 71, when I was in high school, we had our first black teacher. And he was a science teacher, so I got along great with him. And we had one student, and that was it. Here in Mansfield, it was slightly different. There were sections that were black sections. If you go on Main Street, past 30 going north, where Gorman Rupp is, that was originally a Eastern European community, and then eventually became a black community that was there. It was kind of slummy, but there were some nice houses there as well. There were lines that people knew not to go beyond after a certain either a time period of day or night, or that their community was more like the black community was more like on the flats and stuff. But when you go earlier than that, you can see that there are a mixture of people living on the same block, all next to each other, and all the same kind of houses. It wasn't like one was real bad and one was real good. They were all the same conditions, all good houses and everything else. As I've talked to people, I've asked them, like in the movie theaters, was it segregated? Because in a lot of cities, the segregation was that it was upstairs in the balcony. And most people said no, but that when they had all their friends, they were all together, and they were more in the back than in the front kind of thing. But I don't think it was anything actually said, or that you can't sit here, you got to sit here kind of thing.
Yeah, also I believe that it was difficult back in the day for black ownership of property. You had a number of institutional discriminatory actions. For instance, in some of the deeds, there would be restrictions on a black owning a piece of property. I know when my parents bought their first house, this would have been in 1952, they bought a house, the address was 683 West 3rd Street, that's on the corner of West 3rd and Morningside. The house has now been torn down, but there was a restriction in that deed that a black could not own that particular piece of property. But by then, the law had changed, and those restrictive covenants were no longer enforceable. So up until that time period, that kept a lot of blacks from owning property. Assuming you get over that hurdle, you always have the hurdle of trying to find a lender. And as you mentioned earlier, Alan, redlining and providing mortgages to blacks, there was no rush to do that. And as a result, blacks had to go to the secondary market to get a loan, and that would require a larger down payment, higher interest rates, so forth and so on. And I know we mentioned earlier the prospect of a land contract, whereby if you don't have the down payment and you want to purchase a piece of property, you purchase on a land contract. And basically what a land contract is, it's an agreement whereby the seller offers to sell this piece of property to the buyer, and the buyer will make payments on a monthly basis to the seller. And then once, well, at least back then, once those payments have been made, then the deed would be transferred to the buyer. But inherent in those land contracts, if you miss a payment, the contract is void. So quite often I could perceive a savvy seller allowing a family who's, say, on a 20-year land contract. During that 20-year period, if the seller were to miss a payment, I could easily see, if the buyer were to miss a payment, I could see the seller forgiving that and allowing him to make the payment. But when you come close to that 20-year period, when it's time to convey the deed, if they miss a payment, I could easily see the owner say, well, I'm sorry, we're going to void the contract. And at that point, the seller is out completely. Now, in all fairness, the law has changed. So if you're in a land contract for 5 years, I believe it's 5 years, you get the deed. And that prevents a lot of that. But back in the day, that was one of the inherent discriminatory practices that blacks and other folks had to do to overcome in order to own property.
Well said. So, can we talk a little bit about the value of home ownership, especially African American home ownership, and the disparate outcomes that are oftentimes produced when people don't own a home?
Ironically, Alan, and this undoubtedly occurred in the Mansfield area. National Public Radio did a program about this particular segment. After World War II, we had all these GIs coming back home. And one of the benefits of being a GI is that you would be able to get a mortgage loan, which would be guaranteed by the federal government. In certain instances, for instance, Levittown, which was a planned community out east, they would not sell property to blacks. However, they would do it for whites, and the federal government would guarantee these loans. They gave an example whereby you had person A, person B, both being vets. Person A, person B, both wanted a property in Levittown. Person A got it, however, person B did not get it. And it was the same amount, it was $8,000. So person A purchased their property in Levittown, person B bought it somewhere else. Now the value of the property where person B bought it is now, I believe, is worth $90,000, whereas the Levittown property is now worth $500,000. And as a result, that's a significant difference in value, and that value is power. You can use the equity in your home to do whatever. You can give it to your children, and as a result of this institutional discrimination, which in that part was furthered by the federal government, since the federal government would provide a loan for you if you were going to buy a house that discriminated against blacks. So if you're looking at Mansfield, I could easily see that happen. Not necessarily to the extent in Levittown, but I believe the analogy is there.
Do you feel like there are certain conditions in Mansfield that are still driving a black homeownership gap?
I don't think it's as pervasive as it was back in the day, but I believe there are other factors that are leading to it. For instance, employment differences for various reasons. Black income is lower than others, and as a result, you don't have that ability to purchase the property that you want from the mere fact that you just don't have the earning capacity, or you don't have, say, parents who are in a position to be able to help you purchase that property.
Sounds like from your example, by not having the generational wealth, the home ownership gap is then exacerbated.
Exactly, Alan, exactly.
So with this particular structure, the Sarah Thomas House, do you think that we could develop the capacity within your museum to be able to showcase and tell African American stories there?
That's one of the things that I was very proud of when Edward and his family gave us Daisy's stuff, because his mother was the executrix of Daisy's estate. And so they saved all of this, and then we got it. And I've always been looking for material that makes the museum more well-rounded of the community as a whole. Most museums, it's one ethnic group that is focused on. We have, with Daisy's collection and some other things, I think we've got it well-rounded as best as we can right now. Part of the problem is that as older generations are dying off, you don't have the people doing the interviews. You don't have the people actually going and saying, what do you have? What's available? What do you have your grandparents' pictures that were X amount, or whatever? And so every time there's a generation that dies off, all of that information that went with them goes with it. And it doesn't matter what race it is.
Well said. I had plenty of questions, but I also want to give each of you an opportunity to make a pitch, to tell us anything that I forgot to ask.
Yeah, Alan, I would stress the importance of Daisy's family. Like we said earlier, Daisy's father was a slave, and he built this house within 20 years after the Civil War, and unlike most people, in his pocket he carried a document that Scott had just shared with me earlier. The document was a receipt basically stating that he was a free person, and that if someone were, being a black person, you need to say stand out. Someone could come up to you and, challenge your reason for being there, and he had to pull out this paper. Well, he would have to pull out this paper. So you have a person who has to pull out a paper building a house, a brick house, a house that has stood for over 100 years, over almost 150 years, I think, if we do the math right. That says something. That says a lot about our community. And what went on in that house also says a lot about the community. And as I mentioned earlier, all of the people who have said, yeah, I know that house, that says a lot about this community. And it just goes, from my perspective, to show that there is support to maintain this house. and what it stands for. And it would be a gift to the future of this community.
Scott?
Like Edward said, all of that, it's just Daisy's house, when George moved in, there were 3 people that moved into the house. George, who was an ex-slave, his father was the master, and his mother was a slave. When he became a majority, he took them over the river to Ohio to free him, giving the piece of paper saying he he is only responsible to me, he is free. His mother-in-law was also an ex-slave. So 2 of the 3 people that you had moving into that house were ex-slaves. Unfortunately, the WPA, when they did in the 30s, did all their recordings and everything of the ex-slaves. There were none that they interviewed here in Mansfield. Most of them were probably gone already. But Daisy's house was the center of the community. Many people lived in that house, rented a room, stayed there. There were probably meetings there. We don't know that for sure. And with Daisy and her father and Captain Thomas helping start what became part of the NAACP, we've got magazines from her that are the early precursors of just before it became NAACP. But the house itself would be a monument to the community. And to show that it was important enough to save. If I had the money, I'd save it, but I don't.
I remember you sharing with me a little bit about the legacy that Daisy left to the community upon her passing. Can you say a little bit of something about that?
Edward can talk more about this because Edward visited Daisy while she was living with his mother. But when she passed, music was the important thing to her. And she left $171,000 to the Richland Foundation for black music study. And that foundation still exists. I don't know how well it's used. I'm hoping it is used. But again, just to show that she died in the early 70s and was married to Captain Thomas, but not for that long because he went into the soldiers' home in Sandusky. And she was a music teacher. And she, I think, I never met the woman, I wish I would have, but I think she was very pleasant from everything I see, the letters and everything else that we have. And that I think she was pretty savvy, especially when you get married in the mid-20s and you've got a 6-page prenup.
Yeah, Alan, just to further what Scott had said, I would visit his house during the 60s when we were children, and until the time she passed. So we would go over all the time. My mother would go there once a week, whatnot. But when you go into her house, Mrs. Thomas is a very, very dignified, proper person. She was always dressed well, spoke very well, didn't say a mean thing about anybody. And you go into her house, you go into just to give an example of the type of person she is, you go into her dining room. She had a dining room table, and it was always set for 3 place settings. And I asked her, why do you have these place settings? And she said it was for the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, whenever they were to come. She's a very religious person. And as Scott said, she taught piano lessons. And she had no outward signs of wealth at all. And she didn't spend money. And it was assumed that she didn't have the money to spend. And, knowing her for that period of time, and looking at her lifestyle, no one knows she had any money. And then when her estate was open, when you found out that she had this sizable amount of money, and back in 1972, $160,000, that's quite a bit of money. That is significant. And knowing where she came from, with this father who had to keep this letter in his pocket to show her he was a free person, it says a lot.
Quite the journey. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening. This has been an African American Leadership Initiative, or AALI Speaks podcast. We hope that you tune in next time.